Hello, it's 10 o'clock on the 10th of February. My name is Jonathan Greenstein and welcome to today's webinar, Meeting the FCA's New Operational Resilience Requirements, presented by Complyport. Events in recent years, regardless as to whether they're global, national or local, have highlighted the importance of robust, stress-tested frameworks to ensure firms are resilient when faced with unplanned scenarios in order to protect their customers from harm and to ensure market stability. There is now a regulatory obligation on firms to clearly demonstrate how they believe their customers can suffer from an operational breakdown and how they firstly prevent their customers from harm, and secondly, if they can't, how they put it right. Lastly, the regulator wants firms to ensure that their operational breakdown does not have an impact on market stability. The release of the FCA's policy statement PS 21.3 specifically looks at operational resilience and sets some key targets and deadlines for firms to meet. During our webinar today, we will define the meaning of operational resilience and why it matters to your firm, discuss the FCA's PS 21.3 consultation and the requirements, analyze the relationship of risk management and resilience, highlight the practicalities of applying the new regulations, including the utilization of existing frameworks, consider recommended approaches to meet the deadline, including practical examples, and answer questions from the audience. Today's presentation will be delivered by two of Complyport's senior team. The presenters are Darren Schindler, co-head of Operational Resilience Advisory and the founder of Xavier, and Pantelis Angelides, head of cybersecurity and co-head of Operational Resilience Advisory. Now, Complyport has partnered with the London Governance and Compliance Academy, LGCA, who are offering detailed operational resilience training. Please stay tuned until the end of today's webinar, where I will outline an exclusive special offer they are offering to attendees of today's webinar. At Complyport, we are specialist regulatory and compliance and financial crime consultants. Our team are experts in FCA authorizations, day-to-day compliance and regulatory support, and assisting firms in meeting the requirements of and implementing new regulation. In addition to those services, Complyport also provides a RegTech solution to firms that supports them with their compliance monitoring, the management of documentation, and the internal liaising required for sign-off on financial motions, of gift entertainment, etc. Now, finally, before we begin, I would like to cover some brief housekeeping points. Either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on how you have it configured, you'll see a button called Q&A. If you have any questions, please can you ask them there, and we will try to get through as many as we can at the end of today's session. Please do not post questions into the chat function, as this will not be monitored. With all this in mind, we have two very quick polls which we would like to launch ahead of starting the presentation. I'm going to launch the first one now, and I would be very appreciative if you are able to answer it. Let's launch this here. The question is, will you have completed all necessary work to meet the 31st of March 2022 deadline? We'll give all attendees a few moments to answer this, and then we will carry on. Let's give a couple more moments. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll here now, and we'll share the results just so people can see what the consensus is. So as you can see, we've had 97 people respond on this, 66 people, so 68% said yes, they are ready, whereas 31 people said no, they are not. The second quick poll that we would like to share very quickly, I'll launch this now. This is a multiple choice poll. Ahead of the deadline, have you completed the following? If you could please select the answers that you have completed, and we will start the presentation once this poll has finished. I'll give people a few more moments. A couple more seconds just to get a few more answers in. Okay, I'm going to end the poll here now, and we'll share the results. So 73 people responded on this particular poll. We can see the vast majority have identified the important business services, whereas out of those individuals, not as many have undertaken the rest of it, such as setting impact tolerances, undertaking sufficient mapping and testing to identify, and the self-assessment. So we'll stop sharing this poll now. And thank you to everyone who responded to these polls. With this all in mind, I would now like to invite my colleague Darren Schindler to start today's presentation.
Thanks, Jonathan. As you mentioned, my name's Darren Schindler. I've worked at a senior level in large banks, startup banks, and fintechs. Those roles have primarily been in operational and sales roles. So my approach to this is very much from a customer and an operational and not necessarily a risk perspective. So I'm very much a practitioner. Whilst operational resilience is a new regulatory concept, the practical requirements to keep the doors open for customers in a crisis is not new at all. We all aim to do that all the time. This is just a formalisation of something that most businesses are doing on a regular basis. I'm going to run through a quick refresher of the requirements of the new regulations, and then Pantelis, who follows me, and I will try and give some practical examples on how implementing the new policy can be approached. There's nothing new here. You would have all read and seen this, but just for to set the scene, operational resilience is defined by the FCA as the ability of firms' financial market infrastructures and the financial sector as a whole to prevent, adapt and respond to, recover and learn from operational disruption. And here's a list of the firms that are impacted at the time at which this regulation comes into force. And as we mentioned, this is really just a formalisation of most operational infrastructures that sit within businesses at the minute, and a requirement to set some reporting around it. As you know, the FCA have been through a consultation process for this, and the latest policy statement has a number of variations based on feedback. Now, the majority of these are responses. They provide further detail on specific categories that are listed above. I'm not going to read through them, but the one I'd want to pay particular attention to is the assessment of how vulnerable customers may be impacted if there's a disruption to an important business service, and what impact tolerances would be for that group of customers. The issue of vulnerable customers is repeated throughout the policy statement, and it's clearly of high importance to the regulator, and therefore will need to be addressed in any self-assessment. So why does it matter? Well, the papers that have been released discuss the fact that being operationally resilient will help the customer by ensuring firms and sectors remain resilient to major disruptions and can retain access to important business services, and that the financial services sector will be resilient and avoid significant impact to the viability and sustainability of markets and sectors. It has been suggested that by enabling firms to demonstrate their operational resilience, that would make those firms more attractive to customers, and I guess we'll see how that plays out as the regulation comes into force. These dates again have been well publicised, and we've just had a poll that shows where people are in terms of their meeting of the deadlines. And the major deadline here is the 31st of March this year, and at that point, firms will have needed to identify their important business services, set relevant impact tolerances, have undertaken sufficient initial mapping and testing to identify vulnerabilities, and that includes undertaking a lessons learned exercise, and then be able to deliver on request a completed self-assessment report to the FCA. There's a bit more to the overall operational resilience infrastructure, but not a great deal. And whilst the second deadline allows time to identify or to address those vulnerabilities, the overall framework it pretty much needs to be delivered by the 31st of March this year, and then the capabilities to make sure that those impact tolerances are not breached can be built over the preceding 3 years. So in terms of identification of important business services, these should be considered from a customer perspective rather than from an organisational perspective. So for example, it's not about how each division manages risk or business continuity, but it's more about which external services are always required from customers in order to prevent them from intolerable harm, and the markets from being shaken to the point where the soundness and stability of the markets are at risk. When doing the self-assessment report, it's important here to identify that there's a methodology for identifying that important business service. We've got some examples here of what an important business service might be, but one of the things that comes through from the FCA with regards to the self-assessment is it's not just the listing of these business services, but it's very much a methodology for why you believe they're important. When it comes to setting impact tolerances, and as it was discussed on the recent FCA webinar, it's useful to think about this in a slightly different way to a normal or any of the existing risk assessments or frameworks. The aim here is to create a framework to ensure that impact tolerances are never breached. And the FCA stipulates that time must be a feature of that impact tolerance, but there are other benchmarks that can be used, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. So what is intolerable harm? It can include a number of things: financial loss to a customer or an organisation, how many customers are impacted, and the loss of functionality or access they get to a particular service, whether that any disruption would cause a loss of confidence or integrity in an individual firm or relevant markets, and whether there's any potential for contagion risk between firms and markets if there is a destabilising event. And as you can see, in addition to time, there are a number of other impact tolerances that could be in a matrix. And that could include things like the number of customers impacted, the nature of that customer base, whether they're vulnerable or not, and the likely cost it might be to remediate that impact. In terms of mapping, it's been well discussed and reported that this shouldn't include internal functions such as payroll, but should be focused on those areas directly involved in the delivery of important business services to a customer. It's also important to stress that this has to include any external providers. Now, in good news, most of those external providers may be regulated themselves and are therefore preparing their own documentation for operational resilience, but it's important to start that dialogue with them as soon as possible. And as per the policy statement, the mapping should cover five areas: so the processes that are involved in delivering the important business services, all of the technology used to deliver that, any facilities, primarily premises, and that we use to deliver that service, information that's required, and the people that are instrumental in delivering those important business services need to be covered in that mapping exercise. In terms of testing, here's an outline of the guidance relating to testing, and these scenarios aren't really new. Most businesses will be doing some form of testing for the majority of these, and it should include the failure of key IT services, any data breaches, the unavailability of third-party services or people, or any market disruption or failure. And I guess in that, one of the catalysts for this exercise has been COVID, so that would suggest that could be a relevant scenario. And as per any normal testing regime, when setting that testing regime up, the tests should be undertaken regularly. The recommendation is at a minimum of every 12 months. And when there's been any significant change or improvement to that business service. It's not really clear in the documentation, but this should, the lessons learned exercise should be completed as part of the initial testing, a mapping and testing exercise to identify vulnerabilities. And the lessons learned exercise is a retrospective look at those scenario testings to understand what lessons have been learned if there was a breach or close to a breach, what gaps there are as a result of that breach, and what is being put in place in order to rectify those. But that does need to be done as part of the initial exercise and should be included in the self-assessment report. And finally, the self-assessment report is the main document that's required to be in existence by the 31st of March 2022. We'll discuss some thoughts on content a little bit later, but it's important to state here that whilst this doesn't need to be delivered to the FCA at the end of March, they are able to request it, and it should be delivered on request from the 1st of April moving forwards this year. We're just going to move on to some of the practicalities. So just taking a step back and thinking about it practically, it is highly recommended, and the FCA require this, that operational resilience be acknowledged and managed at the highest level of the business, and that the senior leaders in the business should stress the importance of operational resilience to everyone within that business and every relevant partner. I mean, it is recommended that senior leadership commit to any sort of operational resilience, and in many cases that will already be the case, but this is just about documenting it in a cohesive manner. In the way that can be documented, creating and sharing a vision which states that operational resilience is vital to the success of the business and of the industry as a whole, and clearly communicating that vision across the business to ensure that everyone understands its importance and understands its buy-in. And again, this is back to what's important for a business is to make sure that customers get access to those important business services at all times, with an understanding that there is a minimum level that needs to be achieved at all times. And part of the reason for the strategic buy-in is it's likely to impact almost every area of your business, and certainly every area of your business that has a direct relationship with the customer. So this is not an exhaustive list, but almost every area here will need to buy into the ethos and contribute in order for the approach to operational resilience to be effective. Now, for smaller firms, that may mean the inclusion of slightly fewer people because a number of these different areas may not exist. And we do suspect that the proportional response that's outlined by the FCA for smaller firms, it's likely that what that means in reality is that a smaller firm is likely to have fewer important business services, and that the number of people, areas or external partners that are required to deliver that important business services are fewer, but the requirements to protect those important business services and to document operational resilience capability remains exactly the same. That's our interpretation of the proportional response that's outlined by the FCA. So the good news is that it isn't new, and certainly not completely new. Every firm is always committed to ensure their important business services are always available to their customers. So this regulation is really formalising that in a slightly different way. So as a result, many areas of the business will already have thought and potentially documented a lot of the work required to create the appropriate framework. So this slide and the next one gives a flavour on the existing frameworks and management structures which can be used as a base for completing that operational resilience work. And that's where the policies, processes and the people relating to the sourcing and managing of third-party providers. It might be the change or transformation management teams, how business responds in the management of a crisis, what the provisions are for business continuity, how and the nature and content of the existing risk management frameworks, and also all of the business's existing mapping and testing capabilities all have an impact. Beg your pardon, sorry, I should have moved those slides on. So in terms of the specific requirements when it comes to identifying important business services, just some things to consider. I mean, firstly, and think about it from a customer's, not an organisational perspective, as I mentioned before. And for example, naming that business service should be named in a way in which someone from the outside of the business can know what it is. I think when thinking about important business services, there may be some significant overlap between one important business service and another. So for example, access to information may be an important business service, as may be making payments. And each of those are likely to be accessed through the same channels. So there is an opportunity for much of the work that's done in documenting one important business service can be reused when documenting a second important business service. It's also important to provide sufficient reasoning as to why that business service is deemed important. And you can use metrics for that, whether it's market data, the size of your customer base, the nature of your customers, any form of market share data that might exist. Well, we've put in a couple of slides here on setting impact tolerances. So this graph gives a view on how you might consider setting that, and the fact that it's important to differentiate between inconvenience to a customer, harm to a customer where they are disadvantaged and may have a right to remediation, and intolerable harm. And it's really important to, when thinking about setting those impact tolerances, to think about the differences between each of these segments. because when setting the impact tolerances, it is set around intolerable harm. Some other considerations when setting impact tolerances. And again, I would highlight the need to set out the methodology for why the tolerance is set where it is. And that can be by considering the potential customer harm or impact on the market, how any failure on your business might have an impact on others. And also just think about how the impact tolerances might fluctuate through time. For example, how many people access information or need to take cash overnight. The availability of markets to trade shares, whether or not a business is seasonal, I think is important when setting those impact tolerances and how they're managed. And this is just some thoughts on different methods for working through how you might have a methodology for setting impact tolerances, whether it is data-led or whether it's judgment-led, or whether you have a separate approach in order to understanding what those impact tolerances could be and setting them. But whichever methodology you use, it's really important to make sure that that methodology is documented in your self-assessment report. When setting the scenarios for testing, it's also important to make sure these tests include a number of things. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there should be a reasonable spread of scenarios. The FCA quotes severe but plausible. That doesn't mean it needs to be an exhaustive list. The idea being there should be a number of variants in there in terms of the cause of disruption. So whether it's loss of people, breakdown of IT, adding a new service component which has an impact, knock-on impact on other parts of the service. So having a number of variants and making sure that those tests also impact all of the 5 areas that are highlighted before when it comes to mapping. And some other considerations, again, I'm not going to read through them, but just think about the frequency of testing to make sure that that framework remains robust. So setting regular tests and making sure that tests are done on the implementation of any new component of the important business service. And also think about the communications, not necessarily the strategy for communications, but testing the communication capability. What happens if there is a disruption to an important business service? How do you communicate within your teams? If it's reliant on technology, what are the options if technology is one of the issues that's failed? So just thinking about that comm strategy when it comes to delivering this is important. And finally, for me, this is an outline of what's expected to be in the self-assessment report that's due by the 31st of March this year. And again, there's a list of things here, but the bit that's really important to grasp, I think, is putting some of the thinking and the methodology behind why is an important business service been identified as an important business service, the reasoning behind why the impact tolerance has been set where it's been set, how has the mapping been approached, what's the reasoning behind the testing scenarios that have been run. Really think about documenting that lessons learned exercise. It can take the form of some kind of impact analysis report, but really looking back on those tests and understanding and highlighting where any issues were and how you've used that to identify those vulnerabilities. And the report should include the identification of any vulnerabilities through that testing exercise and any action plans in place to address those vulnerabilities over time. I hope that's helped, and I'm now going to hand you back to Jonathan, who will hand you on to Pantelis.
Thanks, Darren. Incredibly detailed, and I'm sure our audience found it invaluable. Now, I would like to welcome Pantelis to carry on today's presentation. We'll just wait for him to share his slides, if you bear with us 2 seconds. Pantelis, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Can you share your slides, please?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Taking over from where Darren concluded, I'm going to expand further with a tactical approach on how to start and navigate through the policy requirements. And I'm sure many of you have been through these steps already, but it would be like a reassurance for you or another suggested approach for those that are looking some more details. The aim of the presentation is to help you operationalize some of the new policy requirements and make those adaptations of your existing resilience arrangements. I'm sure it will help you with relevant conversations within your organizations and with relevant people. So I'm going to cover today the new operational resilience perspective, new relationship of risk management and operational resilience, some tactical steps and mechanisms for compliance, like the impact analysis, some practical examples of mapping and impact tolerances, and in the end, we will see a suggested roadmap for compliance. The new operational resilience policy brings a new perspective, and that was obvious from Darren's presentation. So far, companies establish risk criteria of their business continuity management programs based on the losses which the firm is likely to sustain, such as cost, reputation, and other internal factors. This mindset is shifting clearly, and the focus of the new policy is on the harm which might be caused to the clients as a result of a disruption. Similarly, traditional business continuity programs define recovery time objectives for the critical services based on internal targets and according to the firm's risk appetite. Now, these objectives must be revisited to adopt an outward focus, the harm caused to the consumers. Another change is the approach to recover from a disruption. Traditional business continuity focus is heavy on workaround methods in case of failure. Operational resilience new perspective is to bring those changes in governance, processes, and allocate such resources so that you prevent breaching the tolerances. The authorities do not expect you to abandon the continuity plans you have in place. They expect you to align these plans with the most important business services and show how these will continue to meet the tolerances set. There is some confusion if operational resilience policy can be filtered through existing risk management frameworks, as well as if such frameworks will suffice for compliance with the policy. To clarify this, we can look closely at various documents and views issued by the FCA and Bank of England, for example. Traditional risk management is focusing on reducing the likelihood of a risk through the implementation of controls so that prevent the risk from occurring. For example, prevent a disruption and ensure the firm can absorb financial losses when they do occur. The change that the new operational resilience policy brings is a shift of the starting point. The firm starts from accepting that disruption to its business services is inevitable, so that disruption will develop, and they need to develop those mechanisms to put arrangements in place to manage the disruption within specific boundaries. The operational resilience policy aims to a proactive hardening of the capabilities of your firm to deliver the important business services by looking to integrate the resilience of individual systems and processes. For the sake of illustration, a traditional risk matrix or heat map displaying the residual risks would look like this. Risk matrix will allow the firm to take further decisions and prioritize any additional measures that can be taken to improve the management of those risks that may exceed the risk appetite or even the risk capacity of the firm. In a very simplistic manner, the risk appetite is generally understood to mean how much risk the firm is willing to take. In risk management, you can assume harm will occur and still be within the established risk appetite levels. What we have been told by the regulators so far, impact tolerances would need to be separate from any risk appetites or recovery time objectives, RTOs as we call them. Impact tolerances express an upper limit where a breach is to be avoided, except in the most extreme scenarios. The supervisory authorities anticipate that firms would be able to explain the relationships between the impact tolerances, risk appetites, and RTOs that they have set. A very low probability event, however, may have a high impact on consumers, and that is something that must be identified, mapped, and tested if the firm has a capability to adequately mitigate. What a risk manager should do in this case is to revisit the risk criteria and review risk appetite statements relating to the consumers, the markets, and the firm's safety, and through testing, establish what the firm can achieve in a range of such scenarios. Introducing the harm to the clients, these lines may be shifted. Risk one, for example, on our matrix, if it's a cyber incident for which the company had a medium appetite and classified the risk as low, with a review of the risk criteria and change of focus, the firm may have to reclassify the risk and the appetite due to a likely severe harm to the consumers, especially if that incident is a ransomware, for example. This is a graphical representation of crisis phases, which are applicable to any firm after a severe incident which causes such a disruption that may affect the delivery of one or more of its business, of its important business services. At the point of disruption, and in the absence of contingency measures, the firm potentially will experience a free fall effect and will take significant time to recover the incident, the black solid line. This was obvious with COVID-19, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. If we consider that the firm had some plans in place on how to respond to the disruption, then that drop to their operational level could be absorbed through effective response measures, the red dotted line on our graph. Such measures in the case of a severe cyber incident could be a cyber response plan, a disaster recovery plan, which will support the desired operational level and avoid breaching the tolerances. RTOs are time-bound metrics, which are based on how long it will take the process to be back in operation. Regulators have been explicit in what they expect from firms. They need to know that the firms are anticipating worst-case scenarios for the consumer and the market and plan effective responses to continue to deliver their important services. For this reason, the impact analysis is a critical step for compliance. First of all, you should identify activities which you execute as part of each of the business services. Then estimate impacts using criteria that we will examine, of course, later in the presentation. Determine how quickly the impacts will be crystallized. And this could be based on prior own experience with incidents or from incidents with peer firms or known vulnerabilities. Then decide how long you can tolerate the disruption before this harms the customers, and decide how quickly you have to fix the problem. Let's consider a plausible catastrophic scenario at a hospital and its services in order to understand the approach and the level of impact analysis. Which of these services are important with respect to the customer, in this case, the patient? In this example, it's easy to classify the most important services because the harm to the patient is quite obvious. We could all agree that patients in intensive care units are the most vulnerable, and those who will sustain intolerable harm, threat to life in this case, of a severe disruption like a prolonged electricity failure. The level of harm will drive the impact tolerances here, which in turn determine the priority and the contingency responses. From there on, we look into the resources in detail. We map what we have in place and test if those resources in terms of people, processes, technology, facilities, and information are adequate to ensure the organization can operate with those critical tolerances. Any weaknesses, vulnerabilities, or single points of failure must be rectified in order to ensure that the ICU, in this case, or other important services are resilient, and more importantly, they provide the level of confidence the stakeholders expect from such an establishment. In the next few slides, I'm going to explain a simple and straightforward approach on how to break down the important services and do your mapping. Our suggestion is a two-stage approach. At stage one, first of all, you need to identify the important services which the firm delivers to clients using the 13 criteria of the FCA policy and maybe some other criteria that you think appropriate. Then you identify the critical activities that are linked to each of these services. And for every activity, identify all resources, assets, the dependencies like people needed, premises, technology, information, and any other considerations such as applicable regulations, third-party providers, etc. Let's take an example. We can consider that a proper risk assessment has already taken place for risk scenarios. A set of controls are in place. However, the service is disrupted at some point. Map these activities at a detail you regard appropriate according to the complexity and the risk. In our example here, we identify 6 activities which are necessary to deliver the service, like a payment to a client. Then for each of the activities, we identify and map the necessary resources and supporting assets. It may help to distinguish at this point the internal and external dependencies. Further mapping and granularity must be proportional to the size and the impact of the firm may have to the consumer and financial market in general. The objective of mapping will be to identify dependencies, vulnerabilities, bottlenecks, and most importantly, those single points of failure, which are likely to impact the resilience of each of the services. Such analysis should consider both external factors like the pandemic, for example, as well as internal factors such as a non-malicious or even a malicious error. Especially for disruptions resulting from cyber incidents, the mapping must consider all IT security vulnerabilities involved in delivering the services, and especially those for external systems like cloud platforms or other cloud applications. Your target must be to maintain a holistic view, so to ensure an integrated provision of the services from start to finish. Moving to the second stage of the analysis, we must define the impact. Impact, as Darren already mentioned, is set as a result from the failure of each of these critical activities over time and or from other metrics available. By establishing the maximum tolerable period or level of disruption, the MTPD, for each critical activity, we can identify which of these activities are the most vulnerable and can affect the service as a whole. For example, a failure or corruption of the customer database with payment data results in no outpayment overall. It is worth to repeat that proportionality must govern all mapping exercises. So let's see an example of how we can determine the impact tolerance. We accept that maximum tolerable period of disruption is our impact tolerance in this case. Normally, RTOs, the recovery time objectives, are set less than the corresponding MTPD. Other metrics can be used, such as number of transactions, number of customer calls per day, fluctuations in demand of a service at different times of the day or of the month, depending on the business service under analysis. However, time is the mandatory metric prescribed in the policy. Setting impact tolerances and RTOs for each individual activity of the service is quite useful in case there are specific systems and other supporting assets that, if are not recovered at the specified time, then the overall service may collapse. In the example, we use traffic light color to denote the consumer harm, which I will explain in the next slide. The MTPD value is determined by the scale of impact, in this case with amber and red color. The policy statement outlines 10 different factors to consider when determining harm, which forms a useful baseline. These are generic descriptions of harm and obviously need filtering depending on the nature of the services under analysis. At this point, you can select those factors that are relevant to the nature of the services and establish specific impact criteria using the traffic light scale, like low, medium, high, or any scale you deem appropriate. If you can recall from the previous slide, these impact scales were used to determine each of maximum tolerable periods of disruption. So if there is a system failure, which if it remains down for more than a day, will affect, let's say, more than 100 clients, and the associated harm is classified as intolerable, in this case red, then automatically your impact tolerance is less than a day, and the RTO may be set at anything between a few hours and obviously less than 24 hours. This is a more detailed analysis in a tabular form. On the table, we can map all activities, dependencies, resources, and other factors which will enhance the resilience of each of your services. We map the minimum staff required, especially in the era of the pandemic. This is particularly useful. Critical equipment and their interdependencies with third parties and recovery actions or workarounds. Coming to a close, a suggested roadmap for compliance, irrespective of the point your firm stands today. First, set governance for operational resilience and define responsibilities. A steering committee will be very helpful to oversee the progress. Don't forget that the board and senior management have ultimate oversight of the resilience strategy and must be involved from the start. Assess your readiness by taking an X-ray of your firm operational resilience program. Some firms have a static business continuity framework, which is the time to review and upgrade. A gap analysis or impact assessment will help you to identify those areas of the policy that you must prioritize at first. Obviously, at this stage, the impact assessment will help you to identify your important business services. A remediation plan, which will provide for closing the gaps, will further guide the mapping of services and setting the impact tolerances as shown in our examples. In parallel, you must refocus your risk assessments and identify those severe scenarios with the intolerable harm. All single point of failures and vulnerabilities must be documented so that your operational resilience framework is appropriately reinforced. Your risk appetites, are they less than the client harm thresholds? Redefine them if necessary. Third-party risk and dependencies. Work on the contracts and service level agreements, which will help you resolve failures at the planned tolerances. At the testing phase, you will be able to have a baseline if you can operate within the tolerances set after a disruption. Test the low probability scenarios and take inventory of your performance. Evidence everything. Testing may show that impacts must be reset. You will have a 3-year window with repetitive testing to reinforce the framework and ensure you stay within the impact tolerances. Any incidents in the meantime, apart from the pain that they cause, they offer lessons to learn and opportunities to improve your resilience. The last step is the capacity and capability building, the restructuring of completeness of the operational resilience framework. At this stage, each function will enhance their capabilities in terms of technical and organizational measures, communication plans, contingency plans, cyber incident playbooks, setting key metrics, and a check cycle to ensure the framework is effective. Obviously, during the transition period and beyond the 3 last stages, the roadmap must be revisited, reviewed, and reinforced. Lastly, there are overarching processes which you must establish and implement, and these are change management, stakeholders engagement, monitoring, awareness, and training. A robust operational resilience framework is built over time. It is systematic, dynamic, and you need to restructure what you already have in place, and where you have gaps, put things in order. You have all this information, we're sure, just restructure it to be facing outwards and focus on the clients. Reassess risks, reconsider plausible scenarios with direct impact to the consumer, redirect resources, address critical third parties, brainstorm every other consideration, and involve everyone. Operational resilience is a long haul flight, and for sure it shouldn't be the flight of Icarus. It is expected that at the beginning of the journey you may be off the boundaries, and it's expected it will take time to get it right. Only with effective testing and capacity and capability improvement based on the lessons learned, the firm will manage to balance the thresholds and stay within impact tolerances, while at the same time maintain internal efficiencies. Maturing your resilience will help the navigation. That's all from me. Good luck.
Thank you, Pantelis. Equally as informative as Darren's section. So that now concludes the formal presentation section of today's webinar, and I'd like to open it up to our audience to see if anyone has any questions. Whilst we wait for some questions to come in, I can see we've had quite a few of them so far. I'll be launching a third and final poll, which I'd appreciate if people could respond to. We'll launch that now while we let some more questions come in. We have about 6 or 7 questions at the moment. We'll give it a few more moments for people to respond to this. And once they do, we will move on to the questions. Give it a few more moments, if you don't mind. Fantastic. I'm going to end the poll here now. I'm not going to share the results of this one, but I will have a look at that later on. So in terms of questions, first question, what will the FCA expect to see in firms' operational resilience self-assessment?
I'll take that one, Jonathan. I think we talked about that in my part of the presentation. There is a prescriptive list, so they want to see the identification of important business services. They need to understand where your impact tolerances are set and what the firm's approach to mapping and testing has been, the feedback from that mapping and testing in terms of lessons learned and an identification of the vulnerabilities. And within all of that, with all of those sections, detailed understanding of the methodology used at each stage. So whether it's for identifying the important business service, how and why the impact tolerance has been set where it is, what the approach to mapping has been, the details of the maps, all of the testing scenarios and what the approach to testing has been, and then a framework in place to understand the outputs of that testing, identify those vulnerabilities, put in place action plans via the management of an appropriate lessons learned exercise. So there's a reasonably good framework to understand exactly what's required in that self-assessment report.
Thanks, Darren. Next question, what is the likelihood of the FCA extending operational resilience to all firms as the Central Bank of Ireland intend to do so?
Should I take that one as well?
Yeah, please. Thank you.
It's interesting in the policy statement, they actually say that the operational resilience framework is mandatory for a certain set of industries, and that is listed was listed right at the very start of the presentation. So just for those that, I think one of the questions we've had come in asks this too. So that's banks, building societies, PRA designated investment firms, Solvency II firms, recognised investment exchanges, enhanced scope SM and CR firms, payment institutions, register account information service providers, and electronic money institutions. So they make it really clear as to who's included. That they also, in the policy statement, invite anyone that wishes to participate in putting together an operational resilience framework to do so. I guess we are where we are in terms of what the FCA has stated, and they stated clearly who needs to be involved. However, I don't think, if this bears common sense, and which in many instances it does, there is a strong chance that at some point the FCA may choose to apply this in a broader fashion. At present, that is the list of who's involved.
Great, thanks, Darren. So next question, what actions can the FCA and or PRA take against firms if they haven't taken sufficient steps to be operationally resilient? I mean, if you don't mind, I'm happy to take this one. So far, there have been no new sanctions against firms announced as part of the release of this regime. So the enforcement available to the FCA remain the same. They can face sanctions, fines, and even removal or suspension of permissions. In terms, the next question here, what are the operational resilience requirements for smaller firms?
Okay, I can take that, Jonathan. Thank you. From the policy, we see that irrespective of the size of the firm, if they are within the scope, then proportionality rule will apply for smaller firms. So all the systems and controls described in the policy are applicable to small firms. However, the extent of mapping, the extent of testing, and all this must be proportional and risk-based.
Great, thank you, Pantelis. We've had a few people ask, will the slides or recording be available after the webinar? Yes, this webinar is being recorded and we will send out a link to the recording once this is finished. Another question here, does operational resilience apply to FX and CFD brokers? Any takers on this question?
Well, they're not specifically listed. It will depend on the regulatory status and the permissions they've applied for if they are included in one of the designated criteria that is set. So as banks, building societies, PRA, etc., etc. So I suspect if there is a customer facing arm to that and payments are being made, there's a strong chance the FCA may look to do that, but we probably need to look into that in a bit more detail, depending on each individual firm's permissions. And one of the other questions I think that's come up a number of times is, are insurance brokers covered? I don't think insurance brokers are covered in any of the existing criteria, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility. And I think one of the other questions here is, how would a non-covered firm, how would the FCA expect to look at the BCP for a firm which is out of scope? This is clearly an approach from the FCA to look at regulation and the management of operational resilience from a customer's perspective. I think in any incident where there's a real customer at the other end, certainly if it's a retail customer and especially if it's a vulnerable customer, it would be prudent, even if not included in these firms at present, to understand the requirements that are set within the operational resilience framework and start to consider how to keep the lights on with a significantly disruptive event.
Thanks, Darren. Sorry, go on.
No, I think hopefully that helps.
I've had a question here. So someone has asked, to whom specifically do the rules apply at this stage? So I know we've touched on FX, CFD firms and insurance, and beforehand we did check on that with insurance. They're not insurance brokers, not covered. Specifically, who does this apply to?
Again, we're back to that list that will be on the slides: banks, building societies, PRA designated investment firms, Solvency II firms, recognised investment exchanges, enhanced scope SMCR firms, payment institutions, register account information service providers, and electronic money institutions are specifically noted in the policy statement and PS 21.3.
Thanks, Darren. Are the application of the operational resilience requirements different for a branch or a subsidiary?
My understanding is that it is different for a branch and a subsidiary. A subsidiary is considered within scope because the majority of their operations are here. A branch, the operational resilience of the parent or the originating firm will be tested in their own territory. That's my understanding. We might want to clarify that, but I think there is a difference between the two.
Okay, perfect. What is the situation where a firm identifies a scenario where it concludes that the scenario takes it outside its defined impact tolerances? Is this acceptable, or does it need to increase its operational resilience measures so the scenario will fall within tolerances?
Okay, I can't take that. There is a lot of discussion that some scenarios are so extreme, but according to the policy are still plausible. And I think the origin of this kind of discrimination, it was because of the pandemic. It depends how many scenarios each firm will come up with, and once they perform the testing, in the case that there is, let's say, 5 scenarios, and 4 of the scenarios you will fall within the tolerances, and there is one very extreme scenario which will take, let's say, a lot in proportionate effort to stay within the tolerances, then we could take evidence and put it down in order to, as the time evolves, you can also try to bring that scenario within the tolerance. FCA were very specific that the tolerances in any case should be respected, and they shouldn't be breached. But we understand that there will be some occasions that some scenarios will bring such an impact to the firm. That's why they give you 3-year window, at least by repetitive testing, as I mentioned in my presentation, to try different measures, increase those security, let's say, organizational measures to bring the scenario back into the tolerances.
Thanks, Pantelis. Just going back to the response that we gave on branches and subsidiaries, I have another colleague on this webinar here as well who's just sent me a bit of further information which we can also use to reiterate. So in terms of branches, if they operate largely independently, they may fall within scope, and it is worthwhile checking with your contact at the regulator to see if that would be so. Next question, and we've got time for, I think, 2 or 3 more before we have to leave. For firms that do fall out of scope at the moment, do you envisage that the FCA will have expectations upon them regarding business continuity plans, etc.?
I think that's as per before. I mean, the scope currently is the scope, but the approach is the protection of customers' access to services. And whilst they've not extended it at present, so there's no regulatory obligation to report within this framework at the moment, it's not out of question to suggest it may be expanded at some point in the future. But we don't know.
Thanks, Darren. So we've done a lot of talking about the FCA requirements. Are the requirements from the PRA much different?
There was quite a lot of commentary on that in 21.3 in the policy statement, and I believe the FCA and the PRA have worked quite hard to harmonise the requirements so that it is accepted that where an impact tolerance is set under one regime and a different impact tolerance is set under a different regime, that the most stringent impact tolerance is the one that's accepted across both. So there has been quite a lot of work done to harmonise the approach for operational resilience in both the regulators.
We'll do one final question here. How can operational resilience streams streams of work be tied into outsourcing streams of work?
Okay, we talked about the dependencies quite a lot, and we see that there are a lot of firms dependent on third parties. Definitely, and Darren also touched on that and said about some of your third parties would be either regulated or within the scope of the policy. So, and that's the aim, that there will be a full coverage of third parties, and in that case, all firms will need to ask those sometimes difficult questions if they are suppliers and vendors, and outsourced companies can provide for such operational resilience, and particularly stay within specific tolerances.
Thanks, Pantelis. So before I touch on the exclusive promotion that we are offering to attendees of this webinar, I just want to let everyone know on this webinar that Complyport can assist firms with the operational resilience implementation. As a first step for many firms, we are offering an operational resilience impact assessment. This would be a gap analysis that will map your firm against the regulation, identifying any gaps needing to be filled by the 31st of March 2022. So I mentioned earlier that Complyport can offer an exclusive discount to an upcoming LGCA London Governance and Compliance Academy course on operational resilience. This course is being delivered on the 1st of March, and attendees of this webinar are eligible to a 50% discount on the course fee. We will be sending out a discount code, which you can then put into the platform when signing up for the course, that will give you this discount. I would like to thank all attendees on today's webinar for joining us for this interesting discussion. As mentioned beforehand during the questions, this webinar has been recorded and we'll be putting the recording online soon. Please follow us on LinkedIn to see when it will become available. Thank you and have a very good day.